You're all a bunch of filthy degenerates. So it appears I'm in good company. Yeah! Yeah, the video I made on Rance 01 got a lot of love, and it seems that you guys want more rants, so what choice did I have but to take on the next installment of the series? So today I'm looking at Rance 02 Kai, The Rebellious Maidens. If at any point you think I'm doing a good job, please do leave a like and subscribe for more content. It seriously does help me in the algorithm. Also, Twitter and Discord exist, and consider checking out my Patreon page for early access to future videos. Alright, enough of that. Okay, so before I really get into it, I do need to give two quick disclaimers like in the last Rance video. First, a content warning. The Rance games feature adult encounters of the less than willing variety. If that's something that seriously bothers you, this might not be the video for you. Secondly, because the actual word for those encounters is one of YouTube's no-no words, I'll do what I did in the last one by referring to it as a struggle snuggle. Yes, I stole that from Jimmy Carr. No, I'm not ashamed. Oh, and there will be spoilers up ahead. You have been warned. So to start off, let's talk about the version of the game I'm playing, because there's actually 4 versions of the second Rance game if you can believe it. There's Rance 2, the original PC 98 title from 1990. Then, in 2009, Alisoft released Rance 02, which is effectively a remaster for modern systems. It changes almost nothing about the original game aside from aesthetic stuff, and the script is entirely untouched. Rance 02 Kai is a full-on remake, messing with mechanics, overhauling the script, and rebalancing things to go along with the aesthetic upgrades of Rance 02. Basically bringing the game up to a more modern standard. And lastly, there's Rance 02 Kai Kai, which takes Rance 02 Kai and does another pass on the script, though a much less impactful one, and then does a bunch of minor tweaks and changes to the gameplay. The version I'm playing is Rance 02 Kai. The reason for this is if Rance 1 was any indication, the original game probably didn't age super well. So since I'm not planning on playing multiple versions of the same game, I'd prefer a more polished experience. The reason I'm not going with the most updated version, Kai Kai, is because that version is currently untranslated. I'm no stranger to putting in a ton of time and effort into a single video, but learning an entire language is a bit much. So with all that out of the way, let's take a look at Rance 02 Kai. So the game starts off not long after the conclusion of the first game. Our lustful lady lover Rance and his slave Sill are off to take on a contract and do some hero shit in the process. Rance, of course, also wants to get his dick wet. They manage to find the underground town of Custom, where the mayor explains their plight. The mage Ragesis was protecting the town and had taken on 4 female apprentices to eventually succeed him. After several years, they turned on him, stealing 4 powerful rings which gave them the power necessary to defeat him in battle. He was killed and the town was sunk into the earth as a result. Afterwards, a seal was put on the town, preventing anyone from escaping, and the 4 apprentices, now known as the 4 witches, built a monster-filled dungeon. While they did not appear to be actively warring with the town, the monsters posed an ever-present threat, any men who went to the dungeon to try to fix things never returned, and women had been mysteriously disappearing from the town from time to time. So Rance's task is to put a stop to this thing by any means necessary in exchange for a shitload of money on completion. Alright, so that's the basic premise, and before I go any further with the story, let's talk gameplay. The gameplay of Rance 02 Kai, or at least the combat and dungeon crawling, is completely different from that of Rance 01. The whole chip system, the cards representing the dungeon layout, letter rankings for attack and defense, all gone. Instead, we have a much simpler and honestly more generic system. It's pretty straightforward. You're put in a grid-based map and you move around one tile at a time. When in this map screen, you have several options aside from movement. You can search the area, sometimes uncovering hidden items or moving the story forward. You can find a monster to fight, which makes that process of grinding a little less tedious since the alternative is what we've seen in every JRPG from Final Fantasy to Pokemon, which is walking back and forth to trigger random encounters. And you also have the ability to camp, which will bring up other options such as resting to restore stamina, using any items in your inventory, or calling the level goddess Willis, who is actually the same Willis from the previous game who ran the level shop in Lasis. Good to see she got the promotion. And yeah, that's pretty much the entirety of how exploration works on a mechanical level. It's simple, but it's perfectly functional. Actually, it kinda reminds me of some of the Flash adventure games that I'd play as a kid. It's not something that I feel aged amazingly well, but I think it's something that's so hard to screw up that no matter how good games get, it'll never be full-on unplayable. So as you're making your way through these dungeons, you'll generally be looking for something such as an item or a key you need to move on, a way to access the next witch, or similar. I found it all to be pretty intuitive, though there were a few times where certain parts of the map felt entirely arbitrary. For example, there was this one room with 4 coffins in it. The first contains an item that you need, and one of the task sequences is to find something to give you the leverage to get the coffin open. Then, later in the game, you'll need to do a task for the mummy who can be found in the 3rd coffin. The second and fourth coffins serve no purpose that I could find. Now here's the thing, just from hearing me describe it, it doesn't sound all that bad, and honestly it's not something I'd be complaining about if I weren't going in depth on the game. But looking back, I have to ask why they felt the need to structure it like this. There were 2 event triggers for separate parts of the game in 2 of the 4 identical coffins. And the main issue I have with it is that when you need to go back there the second time, you might be fooled into thinking this tiny little area no longer serves any use. After all, there are plenty of other little rooms and alcoves that require a single visit before you leave it behind forever. Again, it all feels completely arbitrary. It's hard to really articulate it, but this and many other elements of the map don't feel like they were placed with any sense of overall design. Like, imagine you were designing a map for an RPG. Tabletop, video game, doesn't matter. You're given a certain amount of space to work with and all the necessary elements that the map needs to have, like the boss, any treasure and traps, etc. I think that most people who are inexperienced in designing dungeons and fictional maps, and I'm including myself in that group, would probably just kind of design a basic layout and plop all the necessary shit in there and call it a day. And that would be perfectly functional, but there'd be nothing really special about that map, nothing to make it memorable. And to be clear, that doesn't make it bad, it's just not particularly good either. The reason I bring this up is because I feel this is where Rance 02 Kai is at its weakest, despite the fact that it's where you'll be probably spending the majority of your time. And that's a shame because I felt like I was constantly slogging my way through these dungeon crawls that by the end of the game I just did not give a single solitary fuck about in order to get to the next boss or the next story section, which were things I actually did very much enjoy. I just feel like it really held the game back from its full potential, and I shudder to think of how the original game must have played. The combat is also simple, though it does a good job of having extra shit layered on top that makes it feel like it's more complex than it actually is. Combat happens in a turn-based fashion, with the order always being Rance, allies, then enemy. On your turn, you'll have a few options. You can do a standard attack, or a special attack that hits harder but costs significantly more stamina. You can badmouth the enemy, which will usually do nothing, though it will make one boss lose her cool, lowering evasion, and one enemy has a small chance to kill itself when badmouthed. You can also use an item, rest to restore some stamina, or flee. Interestingly, fleeing has a 100% success rate unless you're up against an enemy who you can't run from, like a boss or the Stone Guardians in the very last section of the game. After your turn, your allies will each take a turn, which is entirely driven by AI rather than the traditional JRPG format of the player choosing everything. That being said, the AI is extremely simple and you can usually guess exactly what every character will do on their turn. Let's take Sill for example. When anyone in the party is low on health, she'll prioritize healing them. If not, she'll usually cast an offensive spell on the enemy, though she'll sometimes cast a defensive one instead. And when her stamina is too low for what she wants to do, she'll rest, or in cases where a party member's health is very low and still can't cast healing, she'll use a healing item. Now, I purposely did not do any research on her AI for that explanation. That was entirely down to observation, and it was easy to figure out due to how rigid the AI really is. The addition of AI allies who behave independently is certainly interesting, and it's not something I've seen in a whole lot of party-based games, and certainly not turn-based ones. That being said, if you think about it for more than a second or two, it's pretty clear that the system adds almost no complexity to the game, with the only major exception being the fact that Sill will heal the party when it's needed. Realistically, most of the time your other party members will just attack or use a healing item, and 99% of the time your decision making will not be affected by whatever the fuck your allies are doing unless one of them happens to be at critical health. That being said, it does have a neat little psychological effect where the game feels a whole lot more dynamic than it actually is. While the combat is incredibly bare bones at its core, having all your allies fighting alongside you, dealing and taking damage, makes the fights feel like there's a lot more going on, and I found it a whole lot more engaging than a straight up one-on-one would be. It's not my favorite combat system ever because honestly, it's just too simple to really stimulate me. I need a bit more going on to really get a satisfying experience, but for what it is, it's fine, and at the very least, the combat didn't actively bore me like the original 1989 Rance did. It was just entertaining enough to make me look back on it and think mostly positive things. In the same vein, the boss fights were incredibly underwhelming due to the simplicity of the combat system, even though I did generally have a decent time. There were occasionally a few interesting gimmicks such as status effects, one boss being weakened via badmouthing which you're actually alerted to beforehand, or in one instance there was a room where every enemy encounter could only be damaged by a certain party member. When these things popped up, it gave the fights a nice bit of spice. But for the most part, the bosses were just a standard combat encounter, except they had more health, dealt more damage, and could usually attack all of your party at once. Now, partway through the game, there's a section where Rance and Sill are separated. I honestly don't get Alisoft's insistence on continually separating the two characters with the best chemistry, but that's a rant for later in the video. Since I'm still on gameplay, I need to talk about how this changes things up. Now, on the one hand, Rance's party dynamics dwindle down to fuck all, with everyone just being a pure damage dealer who swallows healing items like a military wife swallows penis. Sill actually changed things up a lot with her ability to heal. But what became a lot more interesting is the sections where Sill has to explore the dungeon with a side character named Bird. Now in this instance, Sill is the party leader, so she's the one you control in combat, and you have access to her offensive spells, an info spell which tells you a bit about your enemy, a weak melee attack, and of course, the heal. I found these sections with Sill to be a lot of fun, and I honestly enjoyed the combat against trash mobs more than when I was controlling Rance, simply because Sill has more options available to her. And I think that highlights my earlier complaint that the core of this game's combat isn't bad at all, but it's far too simple to really be engaging or satisfying, and I feel if they added a few extra layers to what was already there, I could have walked away a lot happier. When you're in the town of Custom, the gameplay is much like Rance 01 in that pseudo-retro system where you can go to the different points of interest and interact with whatever NPC is there, with the possible actions being look, talk, ask, take, assault, and leave. One thing that's very worth noting is that the overall dialogue system with all these different actions has been greatly streamlined from the mess we got in 01. Where the previous game would have a variety of talk and ask options and would bury the story trigger somewhere in a mound of dialogue options, Rance 02 Kai simplifies everything. The talk option will simply give you a choice of who to talk to, and any necessary talk dialogue will happen. Same with ask. Look, take, and assault are usually just there for flavor text and a bit of humor, though once in a while they do serve an actual purpose. The biggest similarity to the convoluted system of the previous game is that the characters will have multiple lines of dialogue, and sometimes you'll need to talk or ask a few times to get results. This makes it so it can be a tiny bit confusing at first when you're trying to move the story on, and maybe you don't realize that you need to ask a second time, but once you internalize it, it becomes second nature to make sure you see all the dialogue. And to be fair, since Rance as a series is comedic in nature, it's worth seeking out all the dialogue anyway. I don't have too much more to say about the town stuff because there's not all that much there. Now another thing I should mention is the economy of the game, which was massively stripped down from the already pretty simple system present in Rance 01. Here, money is useful for only a few things. You can buy healing items for basically pocket change, allowing you to be pretty solidly stocked up at all times. There's a special shop towards the end of the game where you can spend a lot of money to buy items that will unlock new H scenes with Sill. There's another H scene with a side character that comes at a gold cost. And lastly, the main point of the money is that you can buy weapons, armor, and accessories. Now there's no kind of trade-off with the equipment system like there is in some other JRPGs. Every sequential item is a straight upgrade to the one before, and amusingly, when you obtain a better weapon or armor, the old one literally disappears into thin air. Accessories are simply equipable items that give a minor boost in a particular stat. Now this isn't a very robust system or an entirely fleshed out one. For starters, you can only ever buy weapons for Rance, and the only non-Rance armor is a single item for Sill. Additionally, you can randomly find weapons and armor in chests dropped by the monsters, which if you're lucky can completely break things. I personally was able to find the Buster Sword in like the third chest I came across, which is literally the best one you can get until the end game. This basically freed up thousands of gold that I'd no longer have to accumulate, which got me to the point of being totally kitted out way earlier than intended. I'm pretty sure that the only reason money is even a thing in this game is so the player has an additional sense of progression beyond the basic level up system where individual levels don't really matter all that much and instead it's all about the accumulation of levels. Or if I take a bit more of a cynical angle, there's a chance that the only reason this system exists is because the developers felt like they needed to have it because that's just how the genre tends to be. I mean, at one point there's an offhand joke in-game that even though Rance is promised a massive gold reward for his quest, he still needs to scrounge for money to pay for his supplies because that's just how RPGs work. So the developers may have followed the logic of, we're making an RPG. RPGs have money and equipment as a core progression system. Therefore, we will make this game have an equipment progression system even though it doesn't really fit into what we're doing. It honestly just felt like it didn't really add much to the game, and the only time I actually cared about it was when in the late game I needed 15,000 gold to unlock the aforementioned H scenes with Sill. So overall, the gameplay is, I'd say, tolerable. I enjoyed it well enough, but let's be real here. It's on the lower end of fun. I ultimately had a really good time with this game, but it wasn't from the actual game, it was from the writing and these crazy characters. In fact, I kinda think Rance 02 Kai would have been better as a straight up visual novel, because the gameplay was the worst part of the entire experience. So with that, let's get into what you all know I love to talk about, the story and the writing. But first, a little preparation. Okay. Now, I'm ready for Rance. When I first started playing Rance 02 Kai, one thing became immediately obvious. There was a pretty sizable stylistic difference in the writing compared to Rance 01, and it kinda feels like there were entirely different writers working on the two games. The reason I'm not saying anything conclusive on that front is because the in-game credits for Rance 02 Kai are all pseudonyms, whereas the credits for Rance 01 used real names as far as I can tell. And a quick Google search didn't immediately come up with a list of credits for the game. I'm sure if I did some digging I could figure it out, but I don't really want to. But it was actually kind of shocking how different the two games felt on a narrative level. Rance 02 feels a lot more like a full-on JRPG spoof compared to Rance 01, which was a bit more restrained overall. For example, in Rance 02, there were a bunch of instances where characters would break the fourth wall. The explanation for why you have to purchase supplies was because the shopkeeper, Tomato Puree, yes, that's actually her name, tells you that this is an RPG, so you're supposed to have to collect money by killing monsters. And this was far from the only instance of this happening. There were plenty of little in-jokes like that scattered throughout. Compare this to Rance 01, where only one character ever had a fourth wall break, but it was because that character was meant to be a self-aware AI and was completely isolated from the rest of the story, never interacting with anyone aside from Rance and providing little tips for payment if you got stuck. Also, the characters act in a much more parody-esque way in Rance 02. It's hard to explain after the fact, but let's give it a shot. In Rance 01, it was mainly Rance who was this crazy, over-the-top mindfuck of a character, and the way the character interactions worked is that people generally found him endearing or annoying and reacted accordingly. For the most part, anyone who witnessed Rance's darker side either had no recourse like Sill or his victims, or just didn't care, such as Princess Leia and her attendants. So while the characters were all quirky and had very anime personality types, they were all more or less grounded. In Rance 02, everything is given a bit more of an absurdist feel. For starters, Rance is somehow even hornier. But pretty much all the side characters had some sort of extreme to their personality. For example, there's the shopkeeper, and again, don't ask me why her name is Tomato Puree. But her whole thing is that she always phrases her statements in the form of a question. Why? No real reason. It leads to some funny dialogue, but there's never a real explanation for it. And there's the town priestess Rosé, who only took the job because her parents died. She's upfront to Rance about how she's just grifting, pocketing donations, and doesn't even believe in a higher power at all. At one point, Rance walks in on her fucking a demon. She's not just a subversion of the nun trope, she's taken to the logical extreme. Pretty much all the characters work like this, which is pretty striking when you consider the fact that in Rance 01, the characters all operated only slightly outside the realm of normalcy. And to be clear, it's not like either choice is a negative. I think they're both effective ways to deliver a comedic story like Rance. It's just kinda strange that there'd be such tonal inconsistency. Now, to be fair, the first two Rance games were made before the series really got started off on its long-form storytelling. In my last Rance video, I discussed how Rance as a series has a lot of really complex lore and long plot lines, but Rance 01 didn't really have any of that. There were little seeds of world building, but it was ultimately an isolated story. Rance 02 is ultimately the same way. From what others have told me, it's the third game where things really start to develop. Now, aside from Rance 01 and 02, I've only played the original 1989 game and a tiny bit of Sengoku Rance, which is Rance 7. And let me tell you, I stopped playing Sengoku because I could immediately tell that there was a lot of history, both with the characters and the world, that I was missing out on. And I didn't want to continue without being able to really appreciate it. There's a lot that even I as an outsider can see, and it's a little frustrating to play 01 and 02 and not have the story really start moving. And of course, as a YouTuber, I want to talk about it and really get into the nitty-gritty, but it's going to have to wait. But to loop around to the point I was trying to make, since Rance 01 and 02 are essentially the pre-show to the series, I can excuse the tonal differences as long as the rest of the series has some sort of consistency. One thing that I think this more absurdist style of writing does well is the H scenes, which I think are actually a lot better than 01. Not necessarily better in how hot they are, but in how fun they are outside of their use as fat material. Because these characters don't have to behave as normally in this game, I noticed that most of the H scenes, including the struggle snuggle scenes, had a lot of back and forth banter. The girls would interject their own comments and complaints, besides the stereotypical, "Oh no, the penis won't be able to fit" kind of shit that pops up in the realm of hentai. In my Rance 01 video, I talked about how the writers used a specific framework to make it so Rance could do these evil things without completely alienating the players, with such factors as the victim being evil themselves, or Rance's involvement being a net positive. Well, one of those factors I discussed was humor. If the scene is hilarious, we can overlook the terrible things Rance is doing. And while the other factors are certainly at play in Rance 02, it leans far more heavily into the humor factor with all the banter. Honestly, I think that the scenes in 02 are largely more palatable. I mean, I'm personally not bothered by extreme content. I've experienced things like Euphoria, so a regular old struggle snuggle scene is nothing to me. But I do understand that if someone isn't experienced with this type of content, it may be a little disturbing for a while. And really, I think a title like Rance 02 could be someone's entry point into a media that depicts explicit scenes of struggle snuggling, because the humor at play in almost every single scene does take the edge off quite a bit. So let me give an example of a scene I found hilarious. So at one point, Rance and company encounter Feliss, a relatively low-ranking devil. So she does her devil stuff and offers Rance a deal. 3 wishes in exchange for his soul after he dies, with the only stipulations being no wishing for more wishes and no wishing for immortality. So naturally, Rance, being Rance, accepts and immediately wishes to fuck her. She's completely caught off guard, but it's not like she can really refuse. So Rance is entering this state of manic glee that he gets into when he's getting laid. In my Rance 01 video, I described it as being like a kid in a candy shop, and I think that holds up. He's just so happy and losing his fucking mind as he goes to town, and Feliss quickly goes from the domineering devil to kind of freaking out. And it's really hard to describe, but it's funny to see this subversion of the typical devil and mortal interaction. So then, after that's all done, Rance gets his second wish. He immediately wishes to fuck her again, once more throwing her completely off guard. That got a giggle out of me. But then she asks him to reconsider, and he instead wishes for a peach apple at the behest of his allies, which is the item the group needed at the time. And then for his third wish, the post-nut clarity hits, and he wishes for an out to the whole soul collecting thing. So basically, he got to fuck the shit out of this devil for free. And at this point, she just completely loses her cool, and it's honestly hysterical to see this centuries-old supernatural force get completely dominated and outsmarted by this horny dumbass. Again, like the Leah scene from the previous game, I can't really do this bit justice by just talking about it. You really do have to experience it for yourself. So how's the story itself? Well, I'm not going to go point by point because like the last Rance game, I don't think that would be particularly constructive. But here's how the plot goes. I already explained the basic premise where the four witches killed the mage Ragesis and built the evil dungeon. Well, there are a few bits that complicate things. Firstly, you can actually interact with the ghost of Ragesis, who's just kinda chilling. He'll offer some words of advice and is more than willing to talk about the events leading up to his death, but because he's not a cute girl, Rance doesn't give a shit and refuses to listen. Now, pretty early into the game, you'll beat the first of the witches, an inventor named Maria. As you can imagine, once she's incapacitated, Rance snuggles the ever-loving fuck out of her. But afterwards, something interesting happens. Her ring falls off and her personality completely shifts from this haughty and rude demeanor to a meek and kind of innocent one. So after a conversation, we learn the real truth of what's happening. As it turns out, Ragesis completely lied to everyone. He actually gave the witches their rings, and while they did enhance their power, their actual purpose was to brand them as a sacrifice where their magic and very life force would be extracted. Once each ring had absorbed the energy of 10 mages, totaling 40, Ragesis was to use the rings to become unstoppable. The witches were the final 4 he needed. Well, they found out his plans and used the power of the rings to kill him, with the destruction of custom being an accidental side effect of the battle. But when they went to remove the rings, they were unable and soon found that the rings had turned them all evil. While they were free from the threat of Ragesis, they were ultimately under the control of these rings. But if you remember, Maria's ring slipped off. How could that be when she couldn't take it off no matter how hard she tried? Well, the rings can only be wielded by those who are both a mage and a virgin. Once Rance did his thing, she no longer ticked all the boxes, so take a wild guess as to how Rance is gonna save the day. And this lets me pivot into something I found so fascinating and hilarious about the game. In Rance 01, Rance was the hero, but he was the hero despite the fact that he's a massive piece of shit. While he does rescue the girl, help people, and stop a lot of evil from happening, it's all in self-interest, and his negative traits never really end up holding him back due to sheer luck. In Rance 02, it's a little different. Instead of being the hero despite being a piece of shit, he's the hero because he's a piece of shit. A traditional fantasy hero would have either failed to save the day or would have killed these 4 ultimately innocent girls because he would never even consider defiling them. Rance, however, is able to free them of their compulsion while sparing their lives, an objectively better outcome, all because he's willing to snuggle till he pops a blood vessel. And if we look even further to the very end of the game, Ragesis possesses the mayor's daughter, has her seduce Rance, and obtains the rings, leading to a climactic final battle, where Rance and Sill are barely able to defeat him with the help of the witches. A traditional hero would not have had their help and would have been killed as Rance very nearly was. I fucking love this, and I think this is a phenomenal way to handle the story of this character. The story takes Rance's evil side, which in the previous game basically amounted to a funny quirk, and made it a driving component to the overarching narrative, and I think that's very important for the long-term prospects of the series. While the concept of a narcissistic sociopath as a fantasy hero is in itself a great premise for a parody, I don't think that alone could have carried Rance through 10 mainline games and several spin-offs. I think the joke would have gotten old after a while, and there needed to be something else. While the story hasn't really picked up yet, I have a feeling that the series will play off Rance's personality and have the very things that we might condemn him for be his greatest assets moving forward. To really understand what I'm talking about, think of the movie Airplane. Hilarious film that has some of the best absurdist comedy out there. I watched that movie at least 10 times and it never gets old. But imagine if they made 9 sequels. While the premise of an absurdist comedy taking place in an airport setting is great for creating a fucking phenomenal movie, if they'd milked it, they'd eventually have run out the audience's goodwill. The gimmick would have gotten stale. But Rance went strong for decades and is very highly regarded not just for the interesting and varied gameplay systems, but for its story and lore. You just need something more than the gimmick, and I think this is how Rance 02 started to lean in that direction, and let me tell you, I'm fucking here for it. So earlier in the video, I promised a mild rant, and that's coming, but first I need to offer a bit of praise. While there were many tonal and stylistic differences between the remakes of the first 2 Rance games, one thing remained consistent. Rance and Sill have fucking fantastic chemistry. These two have some of the best back and forth banter, and Sill serves as the one person to have any kind of serious familiarity with Rance. She knows him better than anyone, and that offers an avenue for character interactions and development that no other can really provide at this point in the story. So whenever Rance and Sill are having their back and forth, whatever the situation, it was an absolute highlight of the story for me. So why the fuck do Alisoft seem to have this compulsion for them to spend significant portions of the game apart from one another? They did it in the first game, where Sill spent basically the first 2 acts of the story investigating Hikaru's school, and they did it in Rance 02, where after the confrontation with Maria, they get separated in the dungeon, and out of the 6 chapters the game is divided into, Rance and Sill spend 2 through 5 completely separate. I just don't fucking get it. Look, the other characters are great in their own right, and Rance is consistently entertaining. And admittedly, there are a few interesting bits of character exposition with Sill when Rance isn't there to hog the spotlight, but there is absolutely no reason that they had to spend more than half the game apart. These two click together so well, and it just baffles me that Alisoft seems scared of that. Throughout both Rance 01 and Rance 02, all I wanted was to see Rance and Sill go on this quest together, but you just don't get that most of the time, and I think that's such a damn shame. And the good that does come from their time apart in terms of storytelling could have been done in a fraction of the time. They didn't really require dedicated chapters. And look, though I think the length of time they gave to these separate sections with Sill was too much, I have to give them credit for expanding Sill's character and her relationship in regards to Rance. So in Sill's sections, she's trapped alongside Bird, who fits all the stereotypes of the traditional fantasy RPG hero. Goody two-shoes, chivalrous, honor-bound, that whole thing. But what's interesting is that while he is objectively a better person than Rance, he's not nearly as likable. He and Sill are traveling through the dungeon, rescuing this girl who are being kidnapped and violated with a level of brutality that we don't even see from Rance. But here's the thing. Bird quickly becomes completely infatuated with Sill, but it's pretty clear from the start that Sill has some hardcore Stockholm syndrome and is completely in love with Rance and actually sees the good in him. Though he bought her as a slave, she now stays with him by choice. But Bird doesn't accept that, and he gets pretty pushy while completely ignoring what she has to say. Okay, this is gonna be a weird-ass fucking statement, but I low-key think that Rance is better at respecting women than Bird. Yeah, I fucking know, but hear me out. Bird professes his love for Sill, but I don't think he actually loves her, only the idea of her. He loudly declares his passion and that he'll free her from the grasp of the wicked Rance. But he doesn't ever listen or even acknowledge that she has her own thoughts and opinions. He completely dehumanizes her and basically thinks of her as some trophy to collect and put on his shelf. Now Rance. Rance is a dick. He's a selfish, arrogant asshole who doesn't care about anyone else. But think about how he looks and thinks about Sill and all the other girls he interacts with. He does genuinely understand that these are other beings with their own desires and humanity. He just doesn't give a shit. And interestingly, I'd say that Rance is truly all about gender equality, and the only reason he doesn't treat men and women exactly the same is because he just isn't attracted to men like he is women. Yeah, sure, he views Sill as beneath him, but that's how he views everyone. He literally declares himself to be God at one point. But for all the terrible shit that Rance does, he never disregards Sill's identity, and she's actually able to function as her own person in a way that she really can't with Bird. Bird just disregards her entirely in a way that somehow feels even more disrespectful than Rance's constant struggle snuggling. And you start to see why Sill has fallen for him, even though he is objectively a terrible person. And it's actually quite wholesome when they finally get reunited. She's overjoyed, and Rance is a bit less of a dick than usual, and they actually have as loving of an H scene as Rance is capable of. And after a brief confrontation with Bird, Rance figures out that Sill loves him, and you can see just a twinge there. A tiny flicker of a thought running through his mind that betrays the fact that he does actually care for her, despite how he always acts. And that's actually pretty big. Maybe Rance is a little more complicated than he seems at first. Now, as I said earlier, Rance as a series hasn't really started to kick off yet, but I can see them building toward it, and things are slowly starting to pick up steam. It's not quite there yet, and the anticipation is killing me, but it's starting to get good, and I'm kinda hyped. But now, I do have to talk about the ending because it's getting a little too wholesome for a Rance video. So after Rajasis is beaten, the magical essence of the 40 girls who were sacrificed is released, and they are finally free to rest. They were able to stop Rajasis when all hope seemed lost, and even healed Sill from the brink of death. But then they turn to Rance, their savior, and they offer him a reward of his choosing. He can have literally anything he wants. King of the world, immortality, literally anything. With their combined power, they can make it happen. So you know what Rance asks for? A 41-some. Yeah, that is pretty much the perfect way to end this game. Fucking hilarious, and just like the Leah scene from 01, Sill's just off to the side, bored out of her mind, and at the very end you get this cute little chibi animation of an annoyed Sill dragging away a completely drained Rance, and it's just perfect. I fucking love it. Even with minute levels of character growth, Rance is still always gonna be Rance. So overall, I had a really good time with Rance 02, but much like 01, I know there's so much better ahead of me, and I can't wait to dive in. The gameplay of 02 leaves a lot to be desired, but it wasn't outright bad. I just feel like it was extremely generic, and from the little I've played of Sengoku Rance, I know that the series does actually have really good gameplay under its belt. But Rance 02 did not wow me on a mechanical level, and I don't really feel like there's any replay value whatsoever. The story is still just as entertaining as 01, and like I said in that video, I can see the seeds of world building and character development that the series would become known for, but it's not quite there yet. This was a thoroughly enjoyable experience, though admittedly an imperfect one with plenty of room for improvement. I'd say that I'm pretty ready to start working my way through the next game. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please do help me out by leaving a like and subscribing for more content. Big thank you to my patrons, especially my $10 patrons Spawn, Bulk Squat Thrust, and Michael Rotolo. Consider checking out my Patreon page linked below to join them and get early access to future videos. Follow me on Twitter at @adstweets for updates and memes, and join the Discord server for some fun times. Well, with all that being said, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time. Yeah!